the Vietnamese people were different. I mean, it was a different culture. It was kind of primitive. The reason why they spit on the floor is because that's what they did in their village. I mean, they lived kind of in huts. They didn't have running water. They didn't have toilets. I had no idea how to use a toilet. But they were very spiritual people. And part of what I learned was their basic religion was Buddhism. And they were very, very open, very affectionate. Once they got to know you, they were your best friend forever. And I had a hooch maid, and that's a Vietnamese woman that cleans up the quarters we're in, and she cleans our clothes, washes our clothes, irons our uniforms, polishes the boots, things like that. And she used to come in every now and then she would offer me something to eat. And I never felt comfortable about that because I knew her food, you know, was precious to her. She didn't have that much food to eat herself, and to share that with me was an honor in a way. And but she would share this pineapple. Vietnamese pineapple is a sweet pineapple with none of that acid in it. So it's a very, and she knew I liked it. The first time I tasted it, I went crazy. So she'd bring me the pineapple often. And I've talked to some other Asian American veterans too. And the one common bond that we all discovered with the Vietnamese was when they offered us the food. It was a big deal. And it was, I think, almost in a way of bridging their culture and us. And one used to give Mama-san money to make him a decent meal. He hated the junk in the mess hall, and Mama-san would, you know, make rice and all this other good stuff he was used to, because the food was very similar to what we were eating, you know, in our homes, and something that we were familiar with in our childhood. And the Vietnamese women, the younger women that used to pass the food around in the hospital, would giggle every time they saw me, and they would always introduce me to somebody that was half Chinese and half Vietnamese, because when they found out I was half Chinese and half Italian, it was a big deal. And so they would go out and find people to come in to work so they could meet the lieutenant that's half Chinese. And so I got to be pretty well known on the base, on the compound, as this Army nurse that was half Chinese and half Italian. And my maiden name was Lee, and that's what was on my uniform. And they'd say, "Oh, Lee, that's my name," or "That's my cousin's name." They always tried to show me some way of how we were related. When I was in triage and I was being oriented, and they told me that these people were subhuman, and that I had to handle them differently. And that when they sat down, they squatted and they spit on the floor, and they did all these weird things, and to try to have patience because they were subhuman, kind of like monkeys. And it didn't sound right to me, it didn't seem right, but the person that gave me this information was a superior. So I kind of just left that alone and remained confused in my brain. So much was going on at the time, and I was trying to take in so much that was like put on hold back here, like it doesn't sound right to me. And it wasn't until about a couple of weeks later that I was in triage, and an old grandma had come in to triage, and she had shrapnel all over her buttocks. And there was a doctor there screaming at her to pull her pants down, and the interpreter standing there telling her to pull her pants down. And it was at that moment that I started screaming at the doctor. You got to understand, I never screamed at doctors. In nursing school, doctors were gods. You stood up for them. You know, you let them sit down on the chair that you were sitting on. But I was so angry that he was yelling at a grandma. And I told him, you know, how would it be for you if that was your grandmother? How do you think she would feel if you asked her to pull down her pants? She doesn't understand what's going on, and how dare you treat her like that? And if you can't handle her, I'll handle her. And I made this big scene in the triage and felt like a jerk because I had never spoken out like that before. I had put up with a lot of abuse from doctors in nursing school, a lot of abuse as a registered nurse. And a few times I got angry at seeing this, but I had never reacted like that before. And then I continued to react like that after that because I got away with it. I mean, the doctor just went away, and I remember that there was a young corpsman that was a Quaker, and there was another young nurse like myself, and we started to change things because I wouldn't put up with it, and neither would they. And I don't think it was because I was Asian American, it was because I was a human being, and I didn't like this stuff at all. And then it clicked in my head, of course they're not subhuman. You know, this is racism, this is raw racism, and how could I have even allowed it to happen earlier? Especially when they're talking about my cousins. I got to see these people as my cousins. They weren't my relatives because they were removed from me. They were Vietnamese, they weren't Chinese. I didn't know enough about the Vietnamese to know that a lot of them were Chinese, but I saw them as cousins, and I wasn't going to put up with that, and I wasn't going to allow anybody to do that. And so when I saw abuse, I would just say, take care of my GI, I'll take care of your Vietnamese. But the term gook was always used in Vietnam. And it wasn't until a long time later that I realized, or that I even knew, that gook was not a term the Vietnamese used to describe themselves, it was a racial term. And that bothered me, that I fell into that whole line of thought, of all people me. But I guess we just kind of learn through our experiences. So I guess I'm a lot more sensitive to that than I ever had been before. I knew about other racial terms that were used back east, back in New York, but I had never heard gook, I had never heard slope, and so I didn't know that that was not a cool term to use. And there were times when the Vietnamese would talk to me, I know that there was an older sergeant that was an interpreter for us, and one night when it was very quiet, he told me he hated Americans. And I wanted to tell him that I was an American. I mean, you just don't talk about my people like that either. And I asked him why, and he said, because you've made our daughters into prostitutes and you've destroyed our country. You've destroyed our land, he said, not country, our land. And there was nothing I can say to him because he was right. I had seen it, and I couldn't say I'm sorry, I couldn't defend it. All I could do was just sit there and listen to him talk. And I felt embarrassed. I felt embarrassed for my country, that these people were seeing this, that our soldiers were behaving the way they were behaving. They were allowed to behave that way.